What if a normal guy get a superpower to time travel in his office, and he want to defend from a supervillain? Let's go! The morning sun peeked through the bedroom window, gently rousing Victor Cronus from his slumber. As he opened his eyes, he couldn't help but feel a sense of contentment. It was the start of another day in his simple, yet fulfilling life. Victor stretched his arms and glanced at the clock on the nightstand, letting out a small sigh of relief. Right on schedule, he murmured to himself, savoring the predictability of his routine. He had always been a creature of habit, finding comfort in the familiar rhythms that structured his days. Swinging his feet over the side of the bed, Victor padded across the room to his closet, selecting a pressed white shirt and a sensible pair of trousers. As he dressed, he couldn't help but glance out the window, taking in the serene sight of his modest but well-tended garden. Tending to those flowers and vegetables was one of the few hobbies he allowed himself to indulge in. Victor grabbed his briefcase and headed out the door, locking it behind him with a practiced twist of the key. The commute to his office was a familiar one, a predictable routine that he had perfected over the years. He greeted the same barista at the corner coffee shop, nodded to the elderly neighbor watering her lawn, and arrived at his desk precisely on time, ready to immerse himself in the numbers and figures that defined his weekdays. Victor's colleagues often joked that his life was as boring as the spreadsheets he pored over, but he took no offense. To him, this orderly, reliable existence was comforting, a sanctuary from the unpredictability and chaos that lurked beyond the boundaries of his carefully constructed world. As the morning wore on, Victor lost himself in his work, meticulously reviewing expense reports and reconciling accounts. The rhythmic tapping of his fingers on the keyboard and the occasional sip of coffee were the only sounds that punctuated the quiet hum of the office. It was a tranquil, almost meditative state, and Victor reveled in the sense of control it provided. But just as he was beginning to feel the familiar weight of contentment settle over him, something unexpected occurred. A sudden, inexplicable tremor rippled through the room, causing the papers on his desk to flutter and the lights to flicker. Victor's head snapped up, his brow furrowed in confusion as he scanned the office, searching for the source of the disturbance. To his astonishment, he noticed that the glass of water on his desk was slowly, impossibly, beginning to reverse its flow, the liquid droplets defying gravity as they rose back into the cup. Victor's eyes widened in disbelief, and he found himself frozen in place, unable to comprehend what he was witnessing. Time seemed to slow down around him, as if the very fabric of reality had been altered. Victor blinked, desperately trying to make sense of the situation, but the more he focused on the glass, the more his reality seemed to shimmer and distort. Suddenly, a wave of dizziness swept over him, and he felt the world around him begin to fade, replaced by a vivid, kaleidoscopic swirl of colors and sensations. Just as quickly as it had started, the strange phenomenon subsided, and Victor found himself back in his familiar office, the glass of water now resting undisturbed on his desk. He blinked, his heart pounding in his chest as he tried to make sense of what had just occurred. "What in the world?" he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Glancing around the office, Victor noticed that everything appeared to be exactly as it had been before the unexplainable disturbance. His colleagues continued their work, oblivious to the extraordinary event that had just transpired. Slowly, Victor reached out and cautiously touched the glass of water, half expecting it to start moving again. But the liquid remained still, its surface undisturbed. Victor let out a shaky breath, his mind racing as he tried to process what had just happened. Had he imagined the entire incident? Was it some kind of bizarre hallucination, brought on by stress or fatigue? Victor racked his brain, desperately searching for a rational explanation, but none seemed adequate to account for the sheer impossibility of what he had witnessed. Suddenly, a thought struck him, sending a chill down his spine. What if this was not a hallucination at all? What if he had somehow, inexplicably, manipulated the flow of time itself? The mere idea was almost too far-fetched to comprehend, and yet the evidence was there, right in front of him. Victor glanced around the office once more, suddenly feeling a profound sense of isolation. He had always prided himself on his logical, rational mind, but now, confronted with the inexplicable, he found himself adrift, unsure of what to believe or how to proceed. Steeling himself, Victor decided that the only way to make sense of this bizarre occurrence was to test it further. Carefully, he reached out and tipped the glass of water, watching as the liquid spilled onto the desk. Holding his breath, he focused intently, willing the water to reverse its flow and return to the glass. To his astonishment, the droplets began to lift from the surface, dancing upwards in defiance of gravity, until they once again filled the glass, as if the spill had never happened. Victor's eyes widened in disbelief, his mind reeling as he tried to comprehend the implications of what he had just witnessed. This can't be real," he whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and wonder. "It's impossible. It can't be real." Yet, the evidence was undeniable. Victor had somehow, through sheer force of will, manipulated the passage of time itself. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying, as the full weight of his newfound power began to sink in. Glancing around the office once more, Victor felt a growing sense of unease. He had always taken comfort in the predictability and order of his life, but now, that carefully constructed world had been shattered, replaced by the unsettling possibility that reality itself was more fluid and malleable than he had ever imagined. As the afternoon wore on, Victor found it increasingly difficult to focus on his work. His mind was consumed by the implications of his newfound abilities, and he found himself constantly glancing at the glass of water, half expecting it to start moving again. Finally, as the workday drew to a close, Victor gathered his belongings and hurried out of the office, desperate to escape the prying eyes of his colleagues. He needed time to process what had happened, to try and make sense of this extraordinary, life-altering discovery. As he made his way home, Victor's thoughts raced, his mind alternating between disbelief, curiosity, and a growing sense of unease. What did this mean for him? What were the limits of his abilities? And, most importantly, what were the consequences of wielding such incredible power? Once safely inside his modest apartment, Victor paced the floor, his hands trembling as he tried to come to terms with the events of the day. He knew that his life had been irrevocably changed, and the weight of that realization threatened to overwhelm him. Suddenly, a thought occurred to him, and he froze in his tracks. If he could manipulate the flow of time, what else might he be capable of? The possibilities, both exhilarating and terrifying, began to take shape in his mind, and Victor found himself confronted with a daunting decision. Would he use this newfound power for good, to protect the people he cared about and make the world a better place? Or would he succumb to the temptation of wielding such extraordinary abilities, potentially putting himself and those around him at risk? As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room, Victor Cronus knew that his life would never be the same. He had been thrust into a world of unimaginable possibilities, and the choices he made from this point forward would not only shape his own destiny, but the fate of the world itself.